All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. It is my pleasure today to introduce my colleague and friend, Adriane Esquivel-Muelbert. Before I introduce her more professionally, I wanted to tell a short story about how we met, because I think it's instructive, particularly for some of the younger scientists who might be here or be listening. We met first when I think cold emailed Adriane in 2019 about attending a symposium that was supposed to be about why large trees die. Adriane came to the symposium, and by the end of it, I kind of felt it was a disaster, because no one presented really anything about why large trees die. It was scheduled at ESA on Friday morning, so half the speakers canceled once we were listed on the schedule. And it was this empty room. We talked to no one about not the topic, because no one had data. And I was feeling super down. And Adriane was just so enthusiastic after, because no one knew anything about this topic, why these large trees die. And her energy really pushed this into us building this collaboration that's turned into this Gigante project that she'll talk a little bit about today, among many other things. And that project's, I think, become a huge part of our research programs. We now co-advise 2 postdocs, 3 PhD students, and 11 technicians, all coming from this seeming disaster that ended up working out really well. So I just wanted to mention that persistence matters. But more about Adriane. She's a fantastic forest ecologist we'll hear a lot about today. She did her BS first in biology at Universidade Federal do Paraná, a master's in ecology at Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul, and then a PhD at University of Leeds, which is one of the main hubs of tropical forest ecology in our field. And then moved to the University of Birmingham, where she was for a few years, was the founding director of the Brazil Institute there, and now just last week moved to the University of Cambridge, where she'll be for the foreseeable future in the Department of Plant Sciences and the Conservation Research Institute. Thank you all for being here in person and online, and with that, I'll turn it over to Adriane.
Thanks, Evan, for the very nice introduction, and also for the invitation to come here to speak to you all. It's always very great fun to be at CARI, such a nice place to work with very nice people, always very insightful as well. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about forest ecology for a changing planet, and I have the 4 there because I really think that forest ecology can help contributing to our environmental crisis. And I'll take you to this forest, which is probably the warmest and driest tropical rainforest on the planet. It's in the center of Brazil, in the south of the Amazonian basin. And it's a region of transition between the Amazon forest and the savanna. But the transition that you see here is a much abrupt one, and it's the transition between an Amazon rainforest and a field of grazing pasture for cattle. And you can see it's extremely dry, and you can even see the tracks that the cows walk on here as well. And this is something very pervasive across the landscape there. It's not something that happens in one specific area. It's something that happens for hundreds of miles across the whole of the transition between the Amazon and the Brazilian savanna. And these landscapes have been changing, particularly since the 70s. And the change of the landscape meant that the climate, the regional climate in the region is accelerating. The change in climate change, the change in climate in this region is much faster than it's in other regions in the Amazon, because of these local changes in the landscape. And what I'm interested in is not necessarily on the changes in landscape, but what happens to the remaining forests, which still massive fragments of forests that remain in this region. Oops. And what we are seeing there, and we can even see that as we walk in the forest, we are seeing an ecosystem that is living beyond the limits it has been adapted to. This is a photo from a field campaign that Gisele and I did last year in the site. And it was actually very shocking after writing a lot of the papers that describe this pattern, actually seeing it very evidently, all the hypotheses we predicted. And I'm going to navigate you through some of them. But we don't expect in a rainforest to be walking through cracking litter fall and to see the plants wilting as they're even in the understory. So the stresses of this system, it's a combination of stresses. So you have this aridity that is caused by climate change, but also as a combination of landscape change or land use change. But also then you favor plants that are more adapted to arid conditions. So you have, for instance, much greater liana loads than you would expect otherwise. And this is actually a big problem for our field teams. You can expect it's not very easy to walk through in machete trying to find a trail when you have this like entanglement of lianas in your path. And then because these lianas, they actually put a lot of pressure on the crown, they lead to crown breakage that would eventually also lead to greater tree mortality. So this is one example of one very large dead tree that you cannot even see because there's so much liana around it that you don't even see the crown. And then that basically accelerates the system. So you have more gaps, and like this one here, you have more of these big gaps, and the gaps are even bigger because you have the lianas bringing many trees at once together to the ground. And then you have changes in the microclimate. In a system that is already extremely hot and extremely dry, if you open gaps in the forest, then you don't have the protection from the shade anymore, and you have a big change in the environment in these systems. And the more gaps you have, the more you change the environments within this forest, and the more you disturb the fauna, the flora, and the systems in the conditions these plants have been adapted to. So that leads us to like this positive feedback where you have more aridity, you have more lianas, then you have greater mortality that select for fast-growing species. Then we would also have shorter life cycles and will die faster and create more gaps that will then feed back into this faster cycle of the forest. And when we look at the data for across the whole Amazon, we actually see that this region, so here, these are the different Amazonian regions. They are biogeographical regions. The south of the Amazon, which is this region where I'm talking to you about, is the only region when we look at the data where mortality actually jumped from before and after this moment in the Amazon where we start having the big drought. So 2005, we have the biggest drought in the Amazon in 100 years. Then 2010, we repeated that. 2015, we repeated that again. And when we look at the data, the only region that is actually changing is the south of the Amazon, where we are finding these big shifts. So what we are observing in this forest in particular, but it's not just one patch of forest, it's a whole region. We are seeing this system in transition, where we have more degraded forests through warming, extreme events, and deforestation and fires in the landscape. And then this leads to the forest to be more degraded-like. A lot of people use the term savannization, but we are seeing really is a degradation of the forest that then lead to more opportunistic plants that feed back in the system that becomes then more degraded. And a lot of my research is trying to understand what happens to this forest, but also how can we avoid the same things happening in forests like this beautiful forest of Borneo, where we are doing some research as well, and many of the different forests across the tropics. So what my research program tries to do is try to understand the ecology of forests and create solutions to the climate and biodiversity crises. And I focus mostly on the understanding, but more and more I'm trying to move also towards the translating. So how can we translate ecology to then contribute to society? And of course, it would be impossible, and I don't do this alone. I do this with this amazing team of people that makes it possible possible. And you know some of these faces here. You know Vanessa, Evan, but also a lot of collaborators and students that have been allowing this work to happen. You see Ian here and Cesar. And this is really a fantastic group that really allows this to happen, of extremely passionate people as well. This is Gisele here, which you meet if you haven't yet. And our approach is really integrate big data and field ecology and try to collaborate with modelers, remote sensors, experimentalists, so we can have a comprehensive understanding of these forests, how they're changing and how we expect them to change in the future. But also we contribute and trying to contribute more and more with government and artists so we can allow society to also understand the systems and believe on the importance of them and try to contribute to the change we want to make. These are the main research lines in my group. So we look at dynamics. A lot of what we do is trying to understand forest dynamics and how they've been changing. We also try to understand why they change. So we look at the mechanisms behind forest change, linking a lot with colleagues that work with molecular biology, but also with physiology as well. And then I really like to understand also which species are changing and how the changing species composition of the trees that are there are defining tolerance and adaptation of forests. So these are some of the questions we are looking at, and we were grateful to have very generous funders. But I'm going to focus on a few of these in this talk, but I'm happy to talk to you about other questions later. So if you know some of my CV or Evan and my collaborations, you also understand that I'm really keen on understanding tree mortality. And this is a big tree that died in the Amazon. You can see it's hollowed here. It's a really cool photo because you can see the scale of the size of the tree and the size of our very short research technician. But anyway, that's a great scale. So we know that tree mortality is increasing across biomes. There are very massive events in North America and Europe of big outbreaks of tree mortality, in Australia as well. In the tropics, we have seen an increase in tree mortality, but we haven't seen outbreaks as much and big mass events as much as in other regions. The events we've seen, and this is one photo from Central Amazon, are mostly linked to fire and not necessarily to non-human, direct human-caused death. So although we have these dots or scattered dots in the map where tree mortality seems to be increasing, we have most of this research was done looking at events where there are pulses in big tree death, but we don't have an understanding of what is the baseline mortality and in a comprehensive analysis of how tree death is increasing across space. We know when it happens, there are reports, and then they have been put together, and it seems that it's happening in many places, but we would need to really assess a broader area and have a comprehensive spatial assessment so we know whether this is happening consistently or if it's just scatter events. And with that in mind, a few years ago now, my colleague Tom Pugh and I, we work with a large group of collaborators to put together the first global dynamics database for global forest dynamics database. And we brought data from every continent that has forests, basically. And we integrated national forest inventories with the research sites, mostly from the tropics. And we managed to have an understanding of how biomass mortality and also stem mortality is changing across space. So now that we understand mortality distribution, we also, with this data, were able to get the distribution of the of the carbon sink and the biomass stocks, then we can calculate how far we are from moving from a carbon sink where forests are absorbing more carbon than emitting to a carbon source where forests are actually emitting carbon to the atmosphere. So that's what we kind of estimated. So in this map, you can see the regions in red. They are already shift from they are very close to shift from a carbon sink to a carbon source. And what we found that we thought it was quite surprising is that in an increase of less than 50% in tree mortality, which is moving from 1% to 1.5%, which is an increase that has been observed in many regions on the planet, can reverse the carbon sink in 62% of our sampling. So for the majority of the planet, a small shift in mortality can reverse this carbon sink, meaning that these forests are extremely vulnerable to small increases in tree death. And I'll move now from understanding global patterns of forest dynamics to trying to understand mechanism. And that might explain a little bit why I'm here this week. So as Evan mentioned, a couple of years ago, Evan and I decided to look at what kills trees, but particularly what kills large trees. And we worked on this paper, which was our pandemic project, that showed that tree size, the drivers for mortality varied with tree sizes. And the literature seemed to indicate that abiotic drivers, the ones that are changing with climate, tend to affect larger trees disproportionately more than they affect the smaller trees. And with time, that led us to decide to look more into the mortality of these large trees. But the problem, and these large trees, they are extremely important for the biomass in the forest and for the biomass dynamics of the forest. So if you look at changes in mortality for the small trees, for the 1 to 10 centimeter trees, changing in mortality won't affect biomass carbon loss at all. The 10 to 50 centimeter trees, which are the trees that we tend to study, an increase in mortality has an effect in biomass loss, but is not as big as the effect that changes in mortality of big trees would have. So these changes in mortality, particularly of these big trees, will have a massive impact on the biomass that a forest can store. And that's one of the reasons why we started looking at the mortality of these large trees. The problem is that we don't really have good rates of mortality for these trees. We cannot really study them well with the traditional sampling of 1 hectare plot. So this is the error bar. I don't know if you've already seen these graphs from Evans or Vanessa's presentations, but this is the error associated to the mortality rate calculated based on only 1 hectare. So you cannot conclude anything from a 1 hectare plot about the mortality of large trees. But then if you move to 50 hectares, which is the largest forest plots we have in the tropics, you can get some idea, but the error bar is still massive. Note that this is in the log scale. So we really need to expand how we understand the scale at which we look at large tree mortality. And for that, we put together this amazing team. And this is a fraction of the team now because it has been expanding exponentially to work on this project, which is the Gigante project, which I co-lead with Evan. And is the reason I'm here this week. So we have a team here working on the data for this project. And we came out with the idea to look at larger scale, so 1,500 hectares, where we can actually get a good understanding of mortality for these large trees. And then we can get the rate and potentially move to understanding mechanism. And we are using drone technology. So we fly the drones every month. And then we get to the sites, we detect where the gaps are, and we get to the sites very quickly so we can identify the different mechanisms causing tree death. And as you might already know, we are doing this in 5 sites across the tropics, now trying to find collaborations and funding to expand this to other areas too. But what this project does beyond understanding the mortality of large trees, it also creates opportunity to study ecology of tropical forests in a way that we couldn't do before. So we could use these photos to understand how species are changing, or to understand gap dynamics, and even to track orangutan nests across the forests of Borneo. So it goes way beyond what we initially planned for, and we are very keen to collaborate with colleagues to expand or make the most of the potential of these images and the data that we are generating. In addition to doing these flights and getting this ground data, we are also using data from the Forest Plots Network and the Forest Geo Network to understand what is a giant tree, how giant trees are distributed across space. And this is actually work that Gisele is going to be here. So Gisele being Mori is a postdoc in our project, and she arrived last week, and she's going to be here for 6 weeks. So if you have, if you want to chat to her, I thought I would introduce her in this talk. So she's going to be leading this work. So now I will shift again back from the Gigante side to move to the region I've spent most of my time studied, which is the Amazon. And it's an extremely important region in terms of carbon storage. It stores 150 to 200 gigatons of carbon. And also, it's responsible for around 12% of the terrestrial carbon sink. So as a system, has an massive importance for the carbon dynamics of our planet and the climate stability of the planet. But also, it's extremely important for biodiversity. And we are fortunate that maybe 30, 40 years ago, there was a huge network of people and also of data was established to understand these forests. So in Amazonia, but also across South America and beyond, but this started in the Amazon with the Rainforest Network. Several scientists started to establish their sites, so there are inventory plots where people go to the forest every 3 to 6 years, measure the trees, identify the species, which is by any means an easy job. So in 1 hectare of forest in the Amazon, you can have over 300 tree species, and they are very hard to identify. But they have been then going back to the same site again and again and again over decades, and generating this database that allows us to understand the state of the forest, how the forest is changing, and also in many classic ecological questions that allow us to understand why tropical forests are so diverse, or how climate affects diversity, and many other questions, and the evolution of this forest, and you name it. But I was very fortunate to work with this group, and I'm going to show a little bit of the work I have done, particularly some work that we published last week. So what this data allow us to do is to understand the dynamics of Amazonian forests over time. So this is the timeline of the Amazon from the 80s to the 2000s. And the y-axis show you the net biomass change. So this is the difference between how much the forest grows versus how much the forest, the carbon lost by the forest through tree mortality. If the graph is above 0, it means that the forest is accumulating more carbon than losing. So you can see that the Amazon forest works as a carbon sink. It accumulates more carbon than loses. But this graph, this line, has a negative slope. So the capacity of Amazonian forests to accumulate carbon is decreasing. And one interesting fact is that in 2005, you can see a big drop in the amount of carbon that the Amazon can accumulate. In 2010, you see this big drop again. And this coincides with the 2 big droughts in Amazonia. So you can capture big events, the drought events, from the data as well. But there has been a lot of debate on what causes the sink. The Amazon is a mature forest. These sites are all sites in mature forest. So we expect actually this gray light to be above 0 here, which the forest should be somehow in a dynamic equilibrium, and overall it should be near 0. So why is the Amazon forest a carbon sink? Well, sink is equal growth and recruitment. Source is equal mortality. But the main hypothesis behind the Amazon working as a carbon sink is actually that the extra CO2 in the atmosphere is somehow fertilizing this forest. CO2 is one of the main resources for photosynthesis, and more CO2 in the forest means that the forest could potentially photosynthesize more. It also allows you to avoid drought because it increases water use efficiency, and means that this forest can potentially grow more. On the other hand, the decline in the slope means that it could be actually a follow-up from CO2 fertilization, so the forest will grow faster, but also would then, the trees will potentially reach the canopy faster too, and then will be more vulnerable to disturbances, and will eventually accelerate the system, but it could be a consequence of droughts as well. So there has been a lot of debate on whether CO2 fertilization actually happens. There's a line of a school of thought that says that these forests are actually recovering from past disturbances instead of being fertilized by CO2. So one thing that we can do is looking how forest structure is changing over time, and that can give us clues to test the hypothesis of CO2 fertilization. So if you look at here is the distribution of size. So this is diameter size of trees, and this is the number of trees. So if you look at the size frequency distribution in this graph, this is what, let's say, the forest would normally look like, hypothetically. But then if CO2 fertilization is happening, one of the expectations is that the big competitors, the ones that compete better for light and for resources, the winners of this forest will grow more. They will make the most of that extra CO2, and then it will shift the size class distribution here, and you get more big trees. This is one prediction, but also another prediction is that the most limited ones, so the trees that are in the understory, they're struggling in the understory because they don't have enough light. They're close to what we call light compensation point. Once you get extra CO2, they can start growing again, so they will actually benefit from it. Another expectation is that these benefits are going to be shared. While the big ones would do better, the small ones will also do better, so everyone will increase equally, and then you just shift up this line, but you don't change the slope of the distribution. Something that could happen too is that the large trees, they could lose. They are expected to be more exposed to droughts and to storms. So with changing in climate, and now not talking about CO2, but with changing climate, they are expected to lose out. So you change the slope again, but you lose these big trees. So with Rebecca Bunbury, my colleague that did also the PhD in Leeds, we both were working in different times, but on similar questions. And after we finished our PhDs, we got together and started working on those data to try to test this hypothesis. And what we found, and this was published last week, was that we see an increasing mean tree size across the whole Amazon basin. And I've been working with this data set for a very long time, for 15 years now. And I never seen a pattern that is so pervasive across the Amazon. So I never seen change happening across the Amazon as well wide distributed as we see in increasing mean tree size, which is also goes in line with the idea of CO2 fertilization if you think that CO2 is changing everywhere in the same way. We also see a shift in the scaling parameter. So this is basically the curve of that distribution. So we see an increase in that, meaning that big trees tend to be dominating more than they were before. So when we look at the changes in size across the Amazon, if you look at the absolute trends, I don't know if it's very clear here, but we have the blue as the 0 line, and this is basically the distribution of the changes in mean tree size over time across different plots. We see that there is a big increase, and this is a big increase for the large trees. So if you see different, these are trees from 20 to 40 millimeters, smaller than 20 millimeters diameter, 20 centimeters, 20 to 40, and more than 40. The ones that are in the canopy, the big ones, they are the ones who are dominating the growth. But if you look at this data again, but then you look at the relative change, so this is the change relative to the initial tree size, we see that the small ones are actually having a significant increase as well. Not the ones in the middle, like not the ones that are not the winners, but not the shaded ones. They don't seem to have an increase, but we see an increase in number and in size of the small and the big trees. And well, so overall what we found is that these large trees are gaining, but the winners are not taking all. We see these small trees benefiting too. And this goes in line with the idea of what we expect in terms of changing size if we have an increase, we have CO2 fertilization acting across the Amazon basin. This has been interpreted as a positive news. We see the Amazon is somehow resilient, and these trees are somehow resilient to the changes that we expected to be killing the big trees, for instance. But of course, we don't know what will happen in the future, and we still need to understand better what are the consequences of this increase for the large trees and for the small trees too. I'm going to move systems quickly, and I'm going to jump to this very different forest and not as diverse as you can see, which are the forests from the UK. This photo is actually from a forest in Scotland. And these are this is the field team to talk to you more about our work in forest dynamics, but focusing in the UK in a project I coordinated with Estrella Luna Diaz from the University of Birmingham, where we are looking at a project called MEMBRA, which is understanding memory of UK treescapes for better resilience and adaptation. And in this project, I was coordinating the ecology side, trying to understand how these sites across the UK, which we had data for the last, 60 to 40 years, were changing over time. And we were trying to link the understanding in ecology with changes in epigenetics, so trying to understand whether trees that suffered from some stress created some type of memory and then allow them to be more resilient. I'm not going to show you results from epigenetics now because we're still working on it, and it's shown to be a big challenge actually to integrate ecology and molecular biology, particularly because our understanding of what is a good sample size and not. But we are getting there, and maybe in 1 year time, I will have very interesting results to show. But what I can tell you is that this cross-disciplinary research was, we need to speak the same language. We don't. But I'm going to tell you about these long-term records. And these are records that were put together by two ecologists in the UK. And actually, the interesting fact is that they were stored in a box in someone's garage. So Ed has this data from some of the data points were started to be measured in the 60s. And what he had were draws maps of the forest where for each tree you have a number attached that is the diameter. And he'd stored those in his garage for, I don't know, maybe 20 years. So we were fortunate to find out about it and talk to Ed, and yeah, and he was keen to collaborate. So we went to these sites, and the field team managed to measure the trees, find the transects. We had very well marked transects, but people didn't put tags. They were very against tags, so now we are tagging trees. But because we had the very precise maps, actually very detailed, we could find the trees again. So we measure all stems above 5 centimeters diameter. Sorry, guys. And in a subset of the area, we measure also the small diameters too. So this is a standard steps for measuring forest dynamics. And I'll show you one result that to me is the most interesting one, is that in all sites, very consistently, we find a very sharp decline in the number of saplings and small trees. So the very small trees between 1.5 and 5 centimeters were almost gone, completely gone in all of our sites. And this is extremely scary to us, but also not so surprising. And you might be seeing the same things here in the US. So we have a lot of browsing, a massive increase in deer population across the whole of the UK. And we have a lot of diseases too. So this is powdery mildew in an oak tree, in an oak sapling, oak seedling. And it's super rare that we would see any seedling at all in months and months of field work across 10 sites distributed across the whole of the UK. So we reported that. We are working to publish it. But then that led us to now be working on a review that it's trying to understand what are the potential drivers of regeneration decline, and how can they affect different processes that would lead to the regeneration decline. We actually don't have a lot of evidence of trends in regeneration because we don't tend to measure the very small seedlings. So although we have this very great forest dynamics networks that work at mortality a lot and have been looking at mortality a lot, we don't have good data for the small stuff as a community. So, but definitely in the UK and across Europe as well, uncontrolled deer population is a big problem. I'm not sure if that's the case here as well. But I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this translating the ecology. And one thing I wanted to highlight is the science panel for the Amazon. I don't know if you are familiar with it, but the tropical ecologists probably are. So this is a group that actually started from a Brazilian group that then worked with researchers across the whole Amazon basin that have created this forum or a big group that works. It's called the Amazon We Want, that generates documents that allow government and the society to understand the Amazon better and to find solutions for preserving the Amazon. So I was fortunate to be involved in one chapter and one policy brief. And this is a strategy that is extremely successful because they don't only produce the reports, but they have a strong connection with governments in all Amazonian countries and also with international partners. So they have a big presence at events like COP30, for instance. Now they will have a big presence there. So if you want to talk more about this, the science panel for the Amazon as an example of a way to translate science, I'll be keen to talk to you about. Another example I'm going to give is this project that was funded by Serra, which is a big philanthropic entity in Brazil that they fund a lot of science, and now they've been keen to fund more more ecology. So I was involved in this pilot study where they were trying to design a way that they could fund ecology, and a lot of it actually, on my interactions with them, I did mention the Carey Institute as a good model for this group. And they are actually going to fund an institute. They're going to be working on this link between ecology and society, and Marina Hirota, my colleague from the University of Florianopolis, is going to be the one that is going to be directing the institute. But what we did in an exercise of 1 year is that we got together to find a way to inform how to restore the arc of deforestation in the Amazon, which now we talk as the arc of restoration. And we brought together understanding from ecology and from these big networks that show how each species and its affiliation to climate. And with that, we generated this database that allow people that are interested in restoring Amazonian regions to go to one specific pixel and know which species they should be planting there, and what are their climate tolerance, but also what are their uses for humans. So we actually work with an archaeologist that went back in time and looked at which plants have been more used, and then use that information to generate this big database. And as part of that exercise, we then generated a white paper for the Brazilian Supreme Court, looking at what's the proportion of looking at the amount of rain each pixel provides, or the amount of water each pixel of forest provides downstream in the basin through evapotranspiration, and linking that with food production in the Amazon, in Brazil, and showing the impacts of indigenous reserves, particular on the food production in Brazil if you look across the whole basin. So that was something to help protect these indigenous reserves that were compromised, and the Supreme Court was judging on whether to keep these reserves or not. One more thing I wanted to highlight is the DAMA initiative, which is this environmental dynamics of Atlantic forest. It is a network that we are creating of Brazilians from Brazil, so it's a more bottom-up network where we are bringing together Brazilians that had long-term data and trying to do analysis at the Atlantic forest scale, but not done from the global north and done by the Brazilians. So this is something we are starting now, and it has been moving quite fast, but we already started with looking at how then we can translate our research into science, particularly because we know a lot of the policies in Brazil, the environmental policies in Brazil, by being Brazilians, and then we can have potentially a bigger influence than we would have otherwise. And finally, I just want to talk about something to this idea of create solutions and use creativity and art to translate our understanding of ecology, or even create change in how we feel about the systems. So in this project, Membra, we work with a group of artists called the Walking Forest. And we did a lot of activities with them. One of these was this play, where here is the postdoc Bruno and the PhD student Rachel, and they actually presented this play in a music festival in the UK. But the idea here was to simulate a future in which trees would have rights in the UK Constitution, and then the oak tree was prosecuting the humans in the UK for compromising their life. We had a lot of discussions about the rights of nature during the project, and that came because of our interaction with with artists, and that was super inspiring and actually very thought-provoking. And we did a few other activities. For instance, in the end of the project, we had a lot of people from the UK Department for Environment, working together with the artists and with the scientists to design ways that we can implement or link the science into government, but using art as a way that we can speak the same language, which was extremely interesting too, sometimes hard, but very inspiring. And actually, in the end of that project, I learned so much about my science from the artists, because I would speak to them and they will come back to me with their understanding of my understanding, and then they will shift the way I think. So I really recommend working with artists if you haven't done so. And with that, I just wanted to finish my talk with some take-home messages. We are starting to understand the effects of global change on forests. We have a lot of great long-term data that allow us to do that understanding. But really integrating fields, including developments in technology, AI, but also different fields like molecular biology can allow us to understand the mechanisms. And these multidisciplinary approaches, I believe, are the ones who are going to bring the solutions that we need. So thank you, guys.
Thank you, Adriane, for the wonderful talk. We'll now take some questions.
Who picks the questions? You?
Oh, you do.
I'll
just repeat.
Sarah.
Really fantastic talk, Adriane. So cool to see your work all together. I'm curious, the trend in the increasing sizes of Amazon trees is really fascinating, and I'm thinking about what, like you said, we need to understand what this means in the future, and I'm wondering if we're kind of in a transition point where, like, as you're talking about, like, the mortality of big trees has such an influence on the biomass, carbon storage, that will there be, do you think that there could be accelerating mortality because of this shift to big trees and accelerating impacts on
Just to repeat the question quick. Sarah is asking, related to the trend of increasing tree size over time. I think this is correct. Could this pattern, this increase in tree size, also then be feeding back to increased mortality rates?
Yeah. The answer is, yeah. So I think in theory, that is the expectation. There is the hypothesis that trees will accelerate growth, and growth will lead to larger mortality, especially because they would be more exposed. So you have more trees more exposed in the canopy, and that puts them in a completely different environment where they're exposed to lightning, droughts, wind. So if you have larger trees in general, you will tend to have them more exposed. Whether that will translate in higher mortality or not, now we don't know. We didn't find that pattern in our data, but the Gigante project is set up really to test that and to actually understand the mechanisms. And so yeah, that's the expectation. Hopefully they are more tolerant than we think, and hopefully that won't happen, and that would depend on how they evolved to become big, but we don't know.
My question is also about the mean shift in size in the Amazon. So I was wondering about the smaller trees, and like since our reports of like higher turnover of species in the Amazon in some areas, like what if, I don't know how the data is analyzed, but if there is a high turnover of like small size classes, when you expect them, like there's not enough time for them to recruit when you analyze the data or something like that. So it's still turning over very fast. So how that will impact, of course I know you probably control for that, but I just want to know how that was like taken into account.
You mean how recruitment rates were taken into account?
Yeah, so like if the smaller ones are dying faster, but then they're also recruiting, like do you get the signal that only you're getting the signal of the big trees because the other ones are changing too fast?
Okay.
I think just for the online audience, the question is, for that same trend of increasing tree size over time, I think Vanessa's curious about how recruitment versus mortality within those groups that are increasing are contributing to the overall trend.
We didn't control for that. I think that would be something interesting to look at, the recruitment and growth. We look at just patterns of tree size. So the drive of what's happening for that small group we don't have. But actually, size is kind of, it's also increasing there too. Mean tree size within that size class is also shifting. So what I believe that actually tells us is that trees are packing more carbon within that size class. We see a shift in composition that we didn't analyze stratified by size class, but when we look at compositional shifts, it matches a lot what we see here. So the shade-tolerant trees, the ones that are like classified as shade-tolerant, that kind of understory shade-tolerant, that group, that functional group, is increasing in dominance. At the same time, the trees that have higher maximum sizes, so the species that get bigger, were increasing in dominance too. So that kind of like, it's in line with the sizing changes in size that we observed then in this paper.
Maybe a little bit related to Vanessa's question in terms of the recruitment aspect. We talked fairly early on when we were talking about mortality rates and estimating as well, and changing mortality rates. Also about the impact of those small changes in mortality on biomass or carbon stocks, I guess. And a thing I was wondering there is how, the way I imagine this happening is when you get a big tree falling down, you've got a surge of growth of young trees in the light gap. And so, like, what's sort of the compensatory response of rapid growth in carbon uptake, and how does that or does that not balance the sort of loss of carbon uptake from the big tree that was there? Does that make sense?
For the online audience, the question is about the compensation of regrowing trees after a death. So if you have a large tree die, how much does regrowing vegetation in that same area compensate for the loss of that biomass?
So to answer, two things here. First, it would take a very long time for that the amount of carbon that is in that big tree be recovered. Even by lots of small trees, they cannot recover a loss of the tree, of one very big tree, because of the way that biomass is disproportionately distributed within tree sizes. So a big tree can hold much more biomass than many small trees. Another point to make is that with the forest inventories that we work on, they are at the scale that they are not designed to capture gap dynamics very well, because they are 1 hectare plots, and then the big gaps generated by big trees, they are quite rare. So that's why we designed the Gigante protocol, is to actually be able to cap the gap dynamics of those big trees and what happens after as well, potentially. So across space, we should be able, with enough plots, we should be able to then capture that dynamic a little bit better, but still they are not designed so well for that. Follow-up question, yes?
So I think you said that there's a lot more carbon in one dimension.
Yeah.
What is the flux, the rate of change in meters squared of the surface area for big trees versus small? Are they different?
They are very different. Yeah,
So
repeat.
the question's about the flux then also. So in these areas, basically, what would be your rate of biomass accumulation, so your productivity, and maybe you're also interested in respiration. I think you said net flux, so you'd need that in there.
The fact that we always repeat again and again is that the 1% largest tree stores 50% of the biomass in the forest, and also is responsible for 50% of the uptake, the carbon uptake in the forest too. However, if you have a gap, then the small trees will be growing at faster rates than they would be otherwise in 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 the understory. So that would shift a little bit, but still the big tree would have will have accumulation much faster than the smaller ones together. Yeah, Winslow.
All right, just follow up with that one. One more follow-up. So, like a big tree, when it dies, it doesn't go poof, right? It
No.
falls over, and I know decomposition is faster in the tropics, but what is the rate of decomposition versus that accumulation in the smaller trees that are growing in the cap?
Going to repeat that?
Yeah, so the question is about now getting to the decomposition process, adding the respiration in there. So what would be the rate of that carbon emission from decomposing of a tree versus this accumulation process?
Yeah. It depends which species and it depends where, but it could take a very long time. So some trees could take 50 years to decompose, and that would then compensate for. So yeah, then that part of forest will work as a carbon sink. But it could be very fast as well, depending on the species, and it varies a lot. I'm not a decomposition person. I think Evan will be the person to answer that question for you. But yeah, it varies, and it could take a long time, depending on the species that you're losing as well. Yes?
I'm wondering if you have a sense for, or if there's evidence for that positive feedback in mortality, especially with CO2 fertilization in other forests, tropical forests, maybe more dry tropical forests like the Atlantic forest or even the Chaco, if we think that feedback might be happening in those places as well.
The feedback, sorry. Oh.
The positive feedback of like where there is deforestation happening, the edge effects of those plots, you said you saw withering, you saw drying, and that feedback to mortality.
Do you want to repeat that?
I think the question is whether there's evidence of this positive feedback of these various drivers with having like larger edge effects leading to then further mortality, or greater drying leading to more mortality, and some positive feedback there.
One point I want to note is that some of it, so what I was talking about there was not edge effect, because these forests, when we were analyzing, are actually quite far from what we would normally describe to have edge effects. What I was describing there, and I'll get to your question, just a clarification point, I was describing there was more the effect of the land use change impacting regional climate and accelerating climate change in that region that is already extremely hot and dry. Okay, so I believe we have, so we haven't, I don't know of a comprehensive assessment of that. Definitely in areas that are, so the Atlantic forest is a forest that is much wetter in most of it, and I don't know whether that's happening there, but we have areas that are extremely degraded, and then is the edge effect that is taking place, and not necessarily that effect that I'm talking about. I know that similar patterns have been observed in Costa Rica, in the dry forest of Costa Rica, or like the rainforest, but near drier, like kind of like more into the drier part of the gradient. But I think it would be interesting to look at whether that pattern that we see in the Amazon is seen in other places too. I don't think people look at that. We started thinking about that positive feedback because of all the tipping point hypothesis for the Amazon that talks about the positive feedback, but from a different angle, not looking at the inside the forest, but looking at the positive feedback in terms of climate. So I wonder if, so I don't know if other people have thought about, or people working on other regions have thought about that, those feedbacks internally as well. But it will be interesting to do an analysis on other regions too.
Because it's like small trees are really susceptible, and then medium-sized trees are not very susceptible, and then it splits, and maybe big trees are more susceptible, or maybe they're not very susceptible.
This is a great question about a figure in that comparing abiotic and biotic drivers of size-dependent mortality. I think the question is, why might fire lead to additional vulnerability of very large trees? Sort of why does it have that different line from the other ones?
First thing to note is that you can note in that figure that the dotted is when we don't know much about it. And the fire was something that I think we didn't know much of, like sustainability for fire, and we have some guesses, and then one is like, okay, it's not going to change much, and the other is like, it's actually going to, trees would be already in a very stressful environment, and then fire will be an additional factor that would potentially lead for those big trees that are more exposed to all the other environmental drivers should die. But actually, my memory doesn't allow me to go back and then remember exactly why we thought about that split. I don't know if you remember, Evan.
Yeah, it's actually related to wind. There's
Yes,
data showing
true.
that post-fire you have elevated wind-caused mortality over the subsequent next 3 years, and the mechanism is not really known. But from like some very good experimental large-scale work showing this wind by fire interaction that's not well explained. Yeah, and we're right at noon, so we're going to wrap up here. But if you'd like to chat with Adriane more, we'll have lunch after this in the lunchroom, and we'll also have a happy hour at 4 o'clock for those of you here. And thank you, everyone, for attending online. Let's thank Adriane again.